Homer Price. The remainder of Chapter 5. Bright and early the next morning, the Rip Van Winklish stranger was up and wandering around Centerburg. By 10 o'clock, everyone was referring to him as Old Rip and remarking how clever the sheriff was at deducing things. The sheriff tried to see what was under the canvas, but couldn't make head or tail of what it was. Uncle Ulysses peeked at it too and said, "Goodness only knows, but never mind, Sheriff. If anybody can find out what this thing is, Homer will do the finding." That same afternoon, after school was dismissed, Uncle Ulysses and the sheriff saw Homer strolling down the street with Old Rip. "Looks like he's explaining something to Homer," said the sheriff. "Homer'll find out," said Uncle Ulysses proudly. Then they watched through the barber shop window while the stranger took Homer across the square to the parking lot and showed him his car. He lifted one corner of the canvas and pointed underneath while Homer looked and nodded his head. They shook hands and the stranger went to his hotel and Homer headed for the barber shop. "Did he talk?" asked the sheriff the minute Homer opened the door. "What's his name?" asked Uncle Ulysses. "What is he doing?" asked the barber. "Yes, he told me everything," said Homer. "It sounds just like a story out of a book." "Yes, son. Did he get amnesia up in the hills?" asked the sheriff. "Well, no, not exactly, Sheriff, but he did live in the hills for the past 30 years. "Well, what's he doing here now?" the barber demanded. "I better start at the beginning," said Homer. "That's a good idea, son," said the sheriff. "I'll take a few notes just for future reference." "Well, to begin with," Homer started, "his name is Michael Murphy, just plain Michael Murphy. About 30 years ago, he built himself a small vacation cabin out in the hills, someplace on the far side of the State Forest Reserve. Then he liked living in the cabin so much he decided to live there all of the time. He packed his belongings on his car and moved out to the hills." "He thought it to be a dermot?" asked the sheriff. "Not exactly a hermit," Homer continued, "but yesterday was the first time that he came out of the hills and saw people for 30 years. That's why he's so shy." "Then he's moving back to civilization," suggested Uncle Ulysses. "That comes later," said Homer. "I've only told as far as 29 years ago." "Can't you skip a few years, son, and get to the point?" demanded the sheriff. "Nope. 29 years ago," Homer repeated firmly. "Mr. Murphy read in an almanac that if a man can make a better mousetrap than anybody else, the world will beat a path to his house, even if it is way out in the hills. So he started making mousetraps." There was a pause and the sheriff said, "Will you repeat that again, son?" "I said Mr. Murphy started making mousetraps. He made good ones too, the very best. And when one of Mr. Murphy's traps caught a mouse, that was the end of the mouse for all time." The sheriff forgot all about taking notes as Homer continued. "But nobody came to buy the traps. But that was just as well, you see, because 28 years ago, Mr. Murphy began to feel sorry for the mice. He came to realize that he would have to change his whole approach. He thought, and finally he decided to build mouse traps that wouldn't hurt the mice. He spent the next 15 years doing research on what was the pleasantest possible way for a mouse to be caught. He discovered that being caught to music pleased the mice the most, even more than cheese. Then," said Homer, "Mr. Murphy set to work to make a musical mousetrap." "That wouldn't hurt the mice?" inquired Uncle Ulysses. "That wouldn't hurt the mice," Homer stated. "It was a long, hard job, too, because first he had to build an organ out of reeds that the mice liked the sound of, and then he had to compose a tune that the mice couldn't possibly resist. Then he incorporated it all into a mousetrap." "That wouldn't hurt the mice?" interrupted the barber. "That wouldn't hurt the mice," Homer went on. "The mousetrap caught mice all right. The only trouble was it was too big. What with the organ and all, and sort of impractical for general use because somebody had to stay around and pump the organ." "Yes, I can see that wouldn't be practical," said Uncle Ulysses, stroking his chin. "But with a small electric motor—" "But he solved it, Uncle Ulysses. The whole idea seems very practical after you get used to it. He decided since the trap was too large to use in a house, he would fasten it onto his car, which he hadn't used for so long anyway. Then he could drive it to a town and make a bargain with the mayor to remove all the mice. You see, he would start the musical mousetrap to working and drive up and down the streets and alleys. Then all of the mice would run out of the houses to get themselves caught in this trap that plays music that no mouse ever born can possibly resist. After the trap is full of mice, Mr. Murphy drives them out past the city limits somewhere where they can't find their way home and lets them go. Still without hurting them? Suggested the barber. Of course, said Homer. The sheriff chewed on his pencil and Uncle Ulysses stroked on his chin and the barber ran his fingers through his hair. Homer noticed the silence and said, I guess the idea is sort of startling when you first hear about it, but if a town has a water truck to sprinkle streets and a street sweeping truck to remove dirt, why shouldn't they maybe just hire Mr. Murphy's musical mousetrap once in a while to remove mice? Uncle Ulysses stroked his chin again and said, By gum, this man Murphy is a genius. I told Mr. Murphy that you would understand, Uncle Ulysses, said Homer with a grin. I told him the mayor was a friend of yours and you could talk him into anything, even hiring a musical mousetrap. Who ever heard of a musical mousetrap? Said the sheriff. That doesn't hurt the mice, added the barber. As Homer and Uncle Ulysses went off arm in arm to see the mayor. It scarcely took Uncle Ulysses and Homer half an hour to convince the mayor that Mr. Murphy's musical mousetrap could be hired to rid Centerburg of mice. While Uncle Ulysses chatted on with the mayor, Homer dashed over to the hotel to fetch Mr. Murphy. Homer came back with the bearded inventor and introduced him to the mayor and to Uncle Ulysses. The mayor opened a drawer of his desk and brought out a bag of jelly beans. Have one, he said to Mr. Murphy, to sort of break the ice and to make his shy visitor feel at home. Mr. Murphy relaxed and answered the mayor's questions without blushing too much. How do we know this thingamajig of yours will do what you say it will? Asked the mayor. Mr. Murphy just whistled a few bars, tum-dee-a-dee, and a couple of mice jumped right out of the mayor's desk. Of course, Homer explained, the mice come quicker and get removed when the mousetrap plays that tune through the streets. Mr. Murphy guarantees to remove every single mouse from Centerburg for only $30. It's a bargain, said the mayor. I wondered where my jelly beans were disappearing to. And he shook hands with Mr. Murphy. Then he proclaimed Sunday as the day for demousing Centerburg. By this time, everyone knew that the shy stranger's name was Michael Murphy, but people still spoke of him as Rip Van Winkle, Rip for short, because of the sheriff's deduction. Everybody talked about the musical mousetrap that didn't hurt the mice and the mayor's demousing proclamation. The children especially were looking forward to the great event. They watched with interest while Mr. Murphy went over his car and his musical trap to be sure everything was in perfect working order. Homer and Freddie and most of the other children were planning to follow the trap all around town Saturday and see the mice come out and get caught in Michael Murphy's musical trap. Gosh, Homer, said Freddie, let's follow him until he lets them loose out in the country. That will be a sight, seeing all those mice let loose at once. Well, Freddie, I've been thinking it might not be a good idea to follow the mousetrap past the city limits, said Homer to Freddie's surprise. You know, Freddie, I've been over at the library reading up on mice and music. Music can do funny things sometimes. It can soothe savage beasts and charm snakes and lots of things. If we're going to follow this musical trap till the mice are let loose, we better make some plans. Homer and Freddie spent all Friday recess period making plans. They decided that all the children should meet in the schoolyard before the demousing started on Saturday. They arranged a signal, thumbs up, if everything was going along all right, and thumbs down if anyone was in trouble. It's just to be on the safe side, Homer explained. Saturday dawned a beautiful, crisp fall day, fine weather for the grand demousing of Centerburg. Mr. Michael Murphy came forth from the Strand Hotel, and after carefully slinging his long gray beard over his shoulder, he cranked his car and warmed up the engine. He carefully removed the canvas covering from the musical mousetrap and ever so painstakingly arranged the spiral ramps and runways so that no mouse, no matter how careless, could stub a toe or bump a nose. He then climbed behind the steering wheel and the musical mousetrap was underway. A loud cheer arose from the crowd of children as Mr. Murphy yanked a lever and the reed organ started to play. Even before the cheering stopped, the mice began to appear. Through the streets of Centerburg rolled Mr. Michael Murphy in his musical mousetrap. The mice came running from every direction. Fat, donut-fed mice from Uncle Ulysses's lunchroom, thin mice from the churches, ordinary mice from the houses and homes, mice from the stores, and mice from the town hall. They all went running up the ramps and runways and disappeared in Michael Murphy's musical mousetrap. The children followed behind, enjoying the whole thing almost as much as the mice. After traveling down every street in town, the procession came to a stop in front of the town hall, and the mayor came out and presented Mr. Murphy with his $30 fee, 30 bright, crisp, new $1 bills. Just as the mayor finished counting out the bills into Mr. Murphy's hand, the sheriff stepped up and said, "Mr. Murphy, I hope this won't embarrass you too much. In fact, I hate to mention it at all. But this here mystical mousetrap of yours has got a license plate that is 30 years old. A new license will cost you just exactly $30. Mr. Murphy blushed crimson under his beard. "It's the law, you know, and I can't help it," apologized the sheriff. Poor Mr. Murphy, poor shy Mr. Murphy. He handed his $30 to the sheriff, took his new license plates, and crept down the city hall steps. He climbed into his car and drove slowly away toward the edge of town, with the musical mousetrap playing its reedy music. The children followed along to see Mr. Murphy release all of the mice. "You really hated to do that, Mayor," said the sheriff, as the procession turned out of sight on Route 56A. "It's the law, you know, and if I hadn't reminded him, he might have been arrested in the next town he visits. There's no telling how this demousing would have ended if the children's librarian hadn't come rushing up shouting, 'Sheriff, Sheriff, quick! We guessed the wrong book!'" "What?" shouted the sheriff and the mayor and Uncle Ulysses. "Yes," gasped the children's librarian. "Not Rip Van Winkle, but another book, The Pied Piper of Hamelin." "Jiminy Christmas!" yelled the sheriff, "and almost every child in town is following him this very minute." The sheriff and the librarian and the mayor and Uncle Ulysses all jumped into the sheriff's car and roared away after the procession. They met up with the children just outside the city limits. "Come back! Turn around, children!" they shouted. "I'll treat everybody to a donut!" yelled Uncle Ulysses. The children didn't seem to hear, and they kept right on following the musical mousetrap. "The music must have affected their minds," cried the librarian. "Sheriff, we can't lose all these children with election time coming up next month," mourned the mayor. "Let's give Murphy another $30. "That's the idea," said Uncle Ulysses. "Drive up next to him, Sheriff, and I'll hand him the money." The sheriff's car drew alongside the musical mousetrap, and Uncle Ulysses tossed a wad of $30 bills into the seat next to the shy Mr. Murphy. "Please don't take them away," pleaded the librarian. "Come, Mr. Murphy, let's be reasonable," shouted the mayor. Mr. Murphy was very flustered, and his steering was distinctly wobbly. Then the sheriff got riled and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Get 'em low! Get 'em go! Darn it, let 'em go!" And that's exactly what Mr. Murphy did. He let them go. He pulled a lever, and every last mouse came tumbling out at the bottom of the musical mousetrap. And such a sight it was! Well worth walking to the city limits to see. The mice came out in a torrent. The reedy organ on the musical mousetrap stopped playing, and the squeaking of mice and the cheering of children filled the air. The torrent of mice paused, as if sensing direction, and then each Centerburg mouse started off in a straight line toward his own Centerburg mousehole. Mr. Murphy didn't pause. He stepped on the gas, and the musical mousetrap swayed down the road. The mayor, the children's librarian, the sheriff, Uncle Ulysses, and the children watched as it grew smaller and smaller and finally disappeared. Then Uncle Ulysses remembered the children. He turned around and noticed them grinning at each other and holding their thumbs in the air. They paid no attention whatever when they were called. "The music has pixied these children," he moaned. "No, it hasn't, Uncle Ulysses," said Homer, who had just come up. "There's not a thing the matter with them that Doc Pelly can't cure in 2 shakes. Just to be on the safe side, Freddie and I asked Doc Pelly to come down to the schoolyard this morning and put cotton in all the children's ears. You know, just like Ulysses. Not you, Uncle Ulysses, but the ancient one, the one that Homer wrote about. Not me, but the ancient one." "You mean to say Doc Pelly is mixed up in this?" asked the mayor. "Yes, he thought it was awfully funny our being so cautious." Uncle Ulysses laughed and said, "Round 'em up, and we'll all go down to the lunchroom for donuts and milk." "Sheriff," said the mayor, "with election time coming next month, we gotta put our heads together and cook up a good excuse for spending $60 of the taxpayers' money."